My name is Paul Flather, and I'm really delighted to be sitting here in Oxford with the Chancellor of Oxford University, Lord Patten, Chris Patten, who of course in one of his many hats that he's worn in his distinguished career was a Euro Commissioner for External Relations. Now Chris, we're sitting here 3 days after the historic defeat in Parliament by 230 votes of the Chequers plan put forward by the Prime Minister, 2 days after a no confidence vote failed, as expected. How would you describe the state of British politics at this moment? Some people are talking about gridlock.
It's the biggest shambles I can remember, and I'm now in my 70s, and I've been in politics ever since I left university, but I can't remember a situation as bad as this, when a political crisis is turning into a constitutional crisis, when the economic prospects, unless we get these decisions right, will look pretty bad. And when whatever happens, we're likely to find ourselves divided by this issue for some time ahead. It's one of the strong arguments against holding referendums, and we're in this position because we held a referendum which the Prime Minister called in order to try to manage the right-wing English nationalists and the Conservative Party.
The Chequers plan was described rather graphically by The Sun as dead as a dodo, and of course in Oxford we have the only complete dodo, so it's kind of appropriate metaphor for us. Do you see her in any way compromising now? How is she, what is going on in her mind? I mean, surely she's not going to bring back the same plan again.
I very much hope not. I remember what happens with dodos and with the race in Alice in Wonderland, and
yes,
the end of which everybody is said to be a winner.
Quite.
But not everybody is going to be a winner this time round, and the Prime Minister certainly won't be if she simply thinks that she can tinker with this deal and put it back to Parliament, or if she thinks she can go to Brussels and get some magical concession. What the government have been trying to do is to suggest that the backstop, which without getting into gory detail, is the way in which they're trying to deal with the question of the border between the Republic of Ireland and the UK, the only land border,
yes,
which would exist between the EU and UK if we leave, trying to argue that that's of course only temporary. Well, everybody knows it's temporary, but the question is how you decide that this is over. And that doesn't just refer to this so-called backstop, but everything we want after we leave in negotiating our future arrangements. Now, I think it's perfectly clear what the Prime Minister should do. Whether she's got the imagination or ability to do it is another matter. And whether she's prepared for once to take on the right wing of the Conservative Party, because I think it's very difficult to get a deal which is in the interests of the nation, that manages to avoid having a row with the right wing.
This does suggest that maybe her top priority, instead of being the interests of the country, is probably trying to keep the Conservative Party somehow united or not from fragmenting. Well, rather like 1846 or 1905. I mean, these are repeats, aren't they?
I don't think she would have seen it quite like that. I'm sure she thinks that what she's doing is in the interests of the country, because I'm sure she thinks that keeping the Conservative Party together is the only way she can prevent Mr Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, which I think many people would understand her concerns about that. But I don't see myself how you can get a decent deal for the United Kingdom unless you take on the right wing. Now, there are some rather obvious things you would think she would be doing now. If she's concerned to get a majority in Parliament, then the best way forward is to ask Parliament what it thinks. First of all, to ask whether people want to rule out a no-deal exit from the European Union. Secondly, whether they would like to extend Article 50 so we have more time to sort these matters out. Thirdly, what they think of staying in a customs union and perhaps with some agreement within the single market over alignment of standards. And finally, whether they think we should, after all this is over, have another referendum. You could very easily put each of those issues to Parliament, and then each time one was knocked down, go on to the next.
So a series of indicative votes.
A series of votes, and then you would at least know where there was a majority in Parliament, if there is a majority in Parliament. But she's even reluctant, I think, to rule out, which is the first step, that the idea of leaving the European Union without a deal at all, that would be a disaster.
It does seem very strange. Some people say that her plan B is really plan A with a few little tinkering items. And we talked about the Northern Ireland backstop, and if you talk to lawyers, they say, well, actually, there isn't a fudge solution on this, and technology certainly won't solve it, because technology just deals with the money issues and not with the safety issues.
I mean, I've made several speeches on this. It's a sign of incipient insanity when you start quoting your own speeches or going back to your own speeches, and anyway, one going over the same arguments again and again, one starts to lose the will to live. But these are arguments that I've been putting for the last year or so. I've put amendments to legislation on these grounds. There's a very simple point. If you have a different regime or a different set of rules, not least for customs, in two neighbouring countries or areas, then what you have between them is a hard border. And that is true everywhere in the world. There isn't anywhere where that isn't the case, for legal reasons and for other reasons as well. What makes it particularly sensitive in the case of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is it's all related to the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement, which brought to an end the violence in Northern Ireland. And it's interesting that the Chief Constable of the Northern Ireland Police Service has asked for 1,000 officers from England and Scotland to be given level 2 public order training, so that they're available in case of a no deal and in
disorder.
Case of violence, disorder in
and of course
in the Republic
Ireland itself or area has changed its constitution to incorporate aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, so they can't actually suddenly fiddle around with that.
And people, I saw a former Chancellor of the Exchequer on the television this morning, a Conservative Brexiteer, saying, well, it was all because of the Taoiseach, all because of Mr Varadkar, and he should just change his mind. I mean, there are politics in the Republic as well as anywhere else, and whether or not it would be legal for him to try to change things, he'd be swept from office if he backed down on this, which is of fundamental importance to the Republic.
Now, can I ask you about the extension? It seems to me that virtually any sensible or possible scenario out of this political gridlock would probably involve an extension. We'd obviously have to have the permission of the 27 countries. They're quite likely to give it to us if we have something substantial. But if we have an extension, then wouldn't we have to take part under law, European law, in the next European elections, which in a sense would be, in my view, a kind of mini referendum on where we are anyway?
That would depend on how long you ask for the extension. If you wanted an extension for 3 or 4 months, say to the beginning of July, you could manage it. But if you went further than that, I think there would be difficulties.
But it'd be hard to get whatever new scenario emerged done in 3 months.
Not impossible, because you could at least have some issues if you were going to try for a customs union and single market. If you told the European Union you were doing that and you were whitewashing the Prime Minister's red lines, I'm sure that they would give you some things on tick, as it were, and provided you were moving down that road into a transition period. But you're entirely correct that unless we have an extension, it's very difficult to see how we could avoid crashing out with all the embarrassments related to that. I mean, one of the ones which has become clear this morning with a leak from the Department of International Trade is that the Trade Secretary, who was a great Brexiteer, promised us that we would have, by the time we leave, by a second before midnight, agreements with the countries which are at present covered by the EU, which at present, of course, touch us as well, countries where we have to roll over trade agreement. You can't simply replicate them because they're very often different issues, and there are about 40 of those, and we now hear from this leak, or see from this leak, that nothing has been agreed at all, and we're not going to have any of these trade agreements in place.
We're very unprepared. There is a lot of discussion, and you mentioned it earlier as one of your possible indicative votes on another referendum. And you know that there's this what's called the people's vote. I call it a third referendum because it's 75 and 2016. So, but what do you feel about that? Do you have any particular objection to that, as a lot of people do?
I have never voted for a referendum. I hated this one because I think that referendums are a contradiction constitutionally in a system which is based on the Burkean notion of representative parliamentary democracy. But it may be that this is like a snake bite. As you know, you very often need, as an antidote, more snake
That's a wonderful analogy.
In the serum. Yes. So maybe the only way we can get out of this mess is with another referendum.
It'd be horrific if they then came very narrow result.
Yes, it would, but at least then that would end it.
Yeah.
And people would be clearly responsible for their own for what happens to them. I mean, the problem is, at the moment, I think, well, one of the problems, out of many, is that what people were promised in 2016 is quite simply undeliverable. You can't have frictionless trade, you can't have lots of access to our biggest market, and avoid some of the obligations that members already carry themselves. It's an impossibility. It's like squaring circles. You can't do it. And I'm afraid the part of the political class, perhaps all of the political class, is going to be blamed for not delivering something which was always impossible.
My final question was actually about the political class and about political leadership. There's an amazing cartoon in the Times today which shows a sort of broken robot, Mrs. May, and a straw man, Mr. Corbyn. I mean, do you have a comment about political leadership at the moment? I mean, can one make a comment? I mean, obviously it varies from time to time, but there is a feeling in the country that we don't have, tall leaders at the moment.
I think it is a fair point that we wouldn't be in this mess if political leadership was of a rather higher calibre than it actually is at the moment. I think there are some very good people in Parliament on both sides, and if you were trying to shape a consensus around people from Hilary Benn and Yvette Cooper on the Labour side to I don't know, Amber Rudd and David Lidington on the Conservative side, I think you could produce a very sensible solution.
But no chance of a national government, I suppose.
No, well, no, I don't think there is. I think that there is also an additional problem when fanaticism becomes part of the political debate. And as you know, Churchill said, in words to the effect that fanaticism is when you're wrong. And keep on banging on about something where you're wrong, but can't actually stop doing it. And I think that's the position we've been in on Europe. What has happened on Europe is much more, I think, about our views on ourselves than our views on Europe. I think that we've lived in a slightly delusional world for some time, not understanding that we're now still a significant country in the world with many tremendous attributes, but we're a medium-sized country who was rescued in a sense from relative decline, becoming more absolute by joining the European Union back in. That's why Ted Heath took us in. When he did
and
so,
you were there, you were involved in that.
I was. When he did so, we were regarded at the time as the sick man of Europe. And we'd got to a situation where we by and large had Europe on our own terms, and were doing extremely well. Well, that's another argument for another day.
Just one word about Europe. Do you think that the Europeans, they played it by the book, as you'd expect? They have their rules and their sense of order. But do you think they have quite gripped how much damage it is going to do Europe itself? Have they tried hard enough to deal with us? I think it would have done even more damage to Europe if they'd compromised on this extraordinary structure of the single market,
customs union and so on, a system based on law, a system where what used to be the sort of conflicts which might even cause violence are all justiciable. You compromise on that, this extraordinary structure, and I think the whole thing starts to come to pieces.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Lord Patten. One of the things that strikes me is that actually, despite all these shenanigans, there is a shock in that not many of our politicians, even our very bright politicians, quite understand that this is only the beginning of the very beginning. That even when they get through this, then there's a whole process of negotiation which could upturn everything. You know,
that's perfectly true. I mean, I said earlier that I thought it was the beginning of insanity when you started quoting your own speeches, but people used to say that the Prime Minister was trying to kick the can down the road. What she's been trying to do more recently is kick a can full of contents that none of us know uphill, with the prospect of this going on for year after year after year.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much,
Thank you,
Paul.
Chris. Thank you.